Yes. Well, thanks, Christoph and Stefan, for this very kind information. And I'm happy to talk about a subject which I have studied for quite some time, and that is migration and mobility in the Roman world. And thanks also for the invitation, because for me, it was quite interesting to encounter a text that was new for me. And what I will do is offer, as it were, the perspective of someone who reads such a text for the first time, from the idea that it tells us something about migration and mobility in the Roman world. And to give some sort of a background, and very, very briefly, and this is actually a short summary of what is actually quite a complicated topic, but many people assume nowadays that migration is very much a modern problem, and actually a modern phenomenon and a modern problem. And all the issues about integration and mobility and the influx of newcomers are perceived very much in terms of a, well, usually or often as a crisis, and very much a product of modernity, of the coming of the modern world. However, many of my colleagues, I work in a history department, have been studying migration in other periods than contemporary times, and they point out something which I think by now is generally accepted, and that is that migration and mobility is a phenomenon, well, essentially just of all times. And that also means that migration and mobility do occur in the Roman period. And the question then becomes, to what extent is what is happening nowadays is comparable to what is happening in the Roman world, or to what extent are there any differences? And the answer, as always, is of course complex. That is to say, in some aspects, there are very clear similarities. In other aspects, there are also quite some differences. And that brings me to the Pro Archia of Cicero, and to the idea that we can see Archias as a migrant. And that actually the text offers a quite interesting perspective on migration. We can read, that is to say, the Pro Archia as what we would call a migration narrative, as a description of movement through the world by someone who is actually moving. It is, of course, not written by Archias himself, but it is produced by Cicero. That is very important to keep in mind. And what is even more important to keep in mind is that Cicero presents his own view, his own take on what is happening. In the course of his argumentation, Cicero offers from time to time very relatively detailed information about what Archias has been doing, how he has been moving around. At the same time, we do need to be aware that Cicero's aims are completely different. He's not interested in migration per se. That is very much my perspective as a historian of Roman migration. He's not writing, obviously, for me, but he's actually writing to convince his audience, and uses some details about Archias movements to make rather different arguments. That is something that this type of selectivity is something to keep in mind at all times. At the same time, I would argue that the Pro Archia does offer a window on Roman mobility and on Roman migration. And I will explain at some point the difference between these two terms. At present, I use them interchangeably. And it does offer, information or ideas, I should perhaps say, about three aspects. And one of them is the nature of ancient mobility, or the nature of mobility in Roman times, I should say. Another one is conceptualizations about freedom of movement and its importance. And a third one is on the relation between geographical movement, that is to say movement through space, and social mobility, that is to say improvements of your status or downward mobility when you move downwards in terms of status, and the relationship between these two elements, geographical and social mobility. And what I will do in my lecture is to go through each of these three elements, and my aim is to show you what type of information and what type of ideas the Proarchia actually shows. I start with Archias movements, and there's quite some information about what about the whereabouts of Archias. There is one long passage which I'm not going to read out in full, but which is now in front of you on the slide, in which several places are mentioned. First, the fact that Archias was born at Antioch, then subsequent travels through Greece and the rest of Asia. Then it mentions southern Italy, and later in the text it mentions several places in southern Italy, Tarentum, Rhegium, Neapolis, and it also mentions towns in Latium and Rome, and Rome is in many aspects the center of the text. It is the place where Cicero is speaking, but it's also the place where many of the movements, well, as it were, end. So quite a number of places that are mentioned, and there's a sequence of places also mentioned, and it allows some sort of a reconstruction of the itinerary of Archias. Also, there's more information in another passage. Sicily is mentioned, and then Heraclea, which plays quite a large role in the text in southern Italy, is also mentioned. And if you take all these bits and pieces together, you can get an idea of the movements of this young poet. And it appears that, well, he was born at Antioch, he moved to Greece, he moved to Asia Minor, present-day Turkey, and he visited several places in southern Italy, Tarentum, Locri, Rhegium, and Neapolis, and quite importantly, he was in Rome, where he resided many years, and he also went to Sicily and to Heraclea in southern Italy. So we get a sense of the way he's moving through the world, although if you want to reconstruct this in more detail, you run also into some sort of into a number of difficulties. But for my analysis, that's not particularly important. If you look at the characteristics of Archias mobility, some patterns become clear. And there are four elements, I would say. And the first one is that he's moving through the Greek world in a stepwise way. That is to say, step by step, he's moving from place to place. And he resides in Rome for quite some time. From Rome, he goes on campaign to Sicily, and then there is this issue of its enrollment in the citizenry of Heraclea. So these are the elements. Please note that Greek world, the notion of what the Greek world actually comprises by Cicero's time is, well, as it were, it is a bit negotiable, because southern Italy is, of course, also considered to be part of this Greek world in many respects, certainly culturally. What is noteworthy is the following. First of all, there are very large distances traveled, and we have to assume, although Cicero doesn't give any details, that people in principle traveled relatively short distances day by day. So usually we think in terms of something like 20, perhaps 30 kilometers. Obviously, much of the travel will have been done by boat, but even boats went from harbor to harbor usually, and it was quite unusual to travel directly over larger distances. So all of these itineraries, these smaller itineraries, actually might have taken quite some time and quite some effort. What is also quite noticeable is that Rome functions very much as the center of Archias movements. Obviously, we have to take into account that this is Cicero speaking, and of course, for Cicero, Rome is the center of the world. But also, if you look at the patterns of his movements, Rome still is very much the center of his network. What is also visible is something that is quite well known from migration history in general, not only confined to the Roman world, or actually it's much better known from outside of the Roman period. And that is that migrants actually move or combine several types of movement. That is to say, many people who end up living somewhere else do this step by step. That is to say, they move around. They might go back to their original place of origin, to their birthplace, then move again, stay somewhere a bit longer, and then move around again. And at some point, it becomes possible to reside on a permanent basis. And then at a certain point, well, their movements, as it were, stop. They settle down and they settle permanently. And this is actually connected to something I alluded to briefly, the definitional difference between mobility and migration. Usually we use the term migration for these forms of permanent settlement, and mobility is the wider term that captures all types of movement. If you look at the patterns of Archias, you see this combination as well. So stepwise movement initially and permanent settlement as well. What is also noticeable in the way that Cicero presents it is that Archias seems to move without any real obstacles. I've already mentioned the fact that in reality, he will have traveled over quite large distances, which will have taken time and money. That is not mentioned at all, but also otherwise, it seems as if Archias is just moving around from the Greek world to the Roman world without any effort. The question is whether that is whether that matches with reality, and in fact, if you look at the text itself, you can already see that the situation is actually slightly more complex than that. He's not completely moving around freely. And that brings me to the second section of my analysis. Is there free movement in the case of Archias? And the thing is that migration historians point out that there is a universal issue which recurs all the time in any historical period, and that is what you do with people who come from outside. To what extent are they integrated? How do they formulate their own identity? Do we allow them to have double identities? To what extent? What types of expectations are there? And in the Roman case, there is an added issue, and that is that in Roman thinking, being Roman was strongly connected with the idea that you would be able to move around freely. To put it simply, the empire was yours, as it were, and therefore you had, especially if you had Roman citizenship, you had the freedom to move around. There is another issue, and that concerns identity proofs, because if you are moving around, you do not have neighbors who can prove who you are. You do not have a face-to-face community where everyone knows who you are. So how does this work? How do you prove your status? How do you prove your legal status? How do you prove who you say that you are? That is also a universal issue, but it is also very much visible in the case of the Roman world, and also in the text of the Proarchia. Crucially, I think, is the question, should we consider Archias an outsider, or should we consider Archias one of us? And if you look at the logic of Cicero's arguments, Cicero is clearly making the case that Archias is one of us. He belongs. And all the rest is, is trivial, as it were. But at the same time, precisely this is what is at issue, what is debated. So in the text, you actually see two types of tensions recurring, revolving around these issues. One of them is the integration of outsiders. On the one hand, you see that Cicero emphasizes the fact that Archias is actually received in a very welcoming manner. So he gets honorary citizenships and he gets other civic privileges. At the same time, it is clear from the text that actually Archias also ran into difficulties. So his status is actually precisely what is at issue. And there are lots of legal battles, of which the text itself is, of course, the prime example, going on about his claims. So on the one hand, you see these positive elements, but also these negative elements. So there's clearly this tension of what to do with an outsider like Archias, or actually the question whether he should be regarded as one of us or as an outsider. There's also another tension, and that is proving who you are. And this is more a detail rather than anything else, but a detail of a type that I find very interesting, also because it is a recurring problem in many societies, and that is, how do you prove who you are when you come from outside, and what type of evidence do we accept? And Cicero actually makes the case that we should actually trust the most trustworthy types of evidence, and that is not the written evidence, which I think we normally would accept as foolproof, but rather the record of living man. And he brushes aside the idea that written records would offer full proof. Very interesting, this type of tension, and of course this whole idea of offering proof is a recurrent theme, and you should realize that the whole idea of passports is very much a modern phenomenon, closely related to the formation of modern nation states. So, and even nowadays, there's still all these issues. What do you do, for example, when people do not have identity papers? The last element I would like to discuss is the social and geographical mobility that underlies the narrative of Cicero about Archias movements. And this is a slightly complicated issue, but I'll try to explain this to the best of my abilities. Social and geographical mobility, these are two concepts which are very often used. Social mobility is a change in your status or in your position. It can be upward, that is what we're usually analyzing. It can also be downward mobility. Geographical mobility is what we usually call migration or mobility, that is to say, to change your residence. And if you're changing it on a permanent basis, you would call this migration. If it's on a non-permanent temporary basis, you would probably call this mobility. The point is that if you look at the text, that Archias is not only moving through the Mediterranean world, but he's also moving socially upward, I would argue. And then the question is, how does this occur exactly? And this is quite interesting. what you actually see is, I think, the presence of mobility networks. And to understand what is going on, it is, I think, useful to make a difference between two types of of moving around socially. And one is based on what you can. So on the basis of your merit, you actually rise. So for example, you get a better job or something like that. But it's also possible to move around socially because of the persons that you know, and then you get a network. So you move yourself through a network. Now, these concepts are very helpful to understand what is happening in the text. Because if you look at what Cicero says, he clearly makes the claim that Archias' rise is very much based on personal merit. That is to say, Cicero says that he is really one of the greatest poets that has ever lived, and he's making quite some claims about the capacities of his protege. So his claim is very much that Archias is an extraordinarily good poet. But actually, if you look at what he does, you see Archias moving around in the context of patronage networks. He knows people, or he attaches himself to people, and therefore he moves around, and he moves around geographically, and he also moves around socially. So what he's actually doing, what Archias is doing, is first of all, he's writing about the achievements of Romans. And he's quite clearly, and Cicero actually says as much, he's staying in elite circles. And he's also traveling as part of the staff of generals. So rather than that his movements are based on his merits solely, he certainly will have had some merits. We can surely assume that. It's clearly that he is moving around through networks of patronage. And of course, we should realize that Archias certainly is not an exception. In fact, this will have been the norm for people in the Roman world, presumably. So this is not something out of the ordinary, but it's for us quite important to keep in mind, and also for us quite important to distinguish between the claims that Cicero is making and the way we analyze what is actually going on. So my argument would be that Archias' social and geographical mobility occurs in the context of patronage, and also that Archias is not only writing about the empire, which he obviously does, but in a way also is writing himself into the Roman Empire. And this is how I would conclude. And I hope that I've shown how this text, although it is a relatively small text, can tell us something about the nature of Roman mobility, and also about this complicated notion of the freedom of movement. And lastly, also something about the relationship between geographical and social mobility. Thank you very much.